This annual meeting of the New York Financial Control Board will commence at this time. I'd like to thank Mayor Bloomberg for his attendance, along with State Controller Thomas DiNapoli and our New York City Controller William Thompson, and the Acting Executive Director of the Board, Jeff Sommer, is with us. And I'd like to thank all of the staff, and particularly the other board members who are here, who we look forward to hearing in this session for attending as well. We will note that representing the Speaker of the City Council as an observer today is Blair Afron, and Norman Dewitowitz will represent the Speaker of the Assembly, Sheldon Silver. Thank you all for attending. Our last meeting was held on July 28th of 2008. It was one day before I would give an address to New York citizens about our rapidly diminishing economic condition, which would be remembered as being the worst since the Great Depression. Since that time, both the city and the state have taken extraordinary measures to make sure that we are not undergoing some of the financial conditions that are being felt in other states around this union and also in other local governments. But even as we hear about the impending end of this recession somewhere in the fourth quarter of this year, in spite of all the encouraging data, it is clear that we are still in the throes of a very profound economic downturn, a crisis of finance and a crisis of credit. Our out-year deficits, which we had cut from $85 billion to $24 billion, I would not be surprised in our economic forecast this week, might be up by 50%, and it means that we're going to have to conduct the same kind of assiduous discipline to how we manage our economy as we have. And in that regard, we're going to have to limit spending. We're going to have to look at our out-year costs and from where they commence. And we're going to have to stay the course as we have if we're going to come out of this. And so I will continue to work with the mayor and the two controllers, the other members of this board, and those in the public and private sector to do so. Now, I would ask that we read and approve our report from our meeting of 2008, which again was on July 28th. The minutes have been circulated for approval and comment, and I would entertain a motion for approval at this time.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, nay, and the motion carries. We will now examine the four-year plan for the city from 2010 to 2013. I would ask respectfully if Mayor Bloomberg is prepared to make that presentation.
I am, Governor, and thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Before I comment on the city's financial plan, I would like to thank the members of the Financial Control Board for their steady leadership. The public may not remember, but this board was first created in extraordinary circumstances, the grave fiscal crisis of the 1970s that drove New York City to the brink of bankruptcy. The FCB helped pull New York through its very worst days, and still today the thoughtful and diligent service shown by FCC board members and staff makes an enormous difference in keeping our city on a sound financial footing. The world has changed drastically since the last time I spoke before this board. By last fall, what had started as a meltdown in subprime housing mortgages had become a once-in-a-generation global financial crisis, with the nation's economy in recession and New York at the epicenter of the crisis. Our tax revenues plummeted. History has shown us that when the economy turns down, New York City tends to fall harder and faster than the rest of the nation. Today, New York is certainly feeling the effect of the national recession. Far too many people are struggling to hold on to their homes and their jobs, and our unemployment rate has risen to levels not seen in years. But I will say there are some bright spots on the horizon. While our financial service industry has been hit very hard, other sectors of our economy are performing better than expected, and the vital signs of the city's economy remain a lot stronger than in much of the rest of the nation, which suggests that instead of bearing the full brunt of the national recession, as we have in the past, New York may well be able to avoid some of its most devastating effects. Total employment in the city has contracted by 2.9% since August of '08, a significant decline, but still less severe than the national decline of 4.7%. What's more, the labor force is growing faster in New York City than elsewhere in the country. Our growth at 1.6% is nearly twice that of the nation's at 0.7%. The fact that people continue to come here to find work or stay here despite job losses indicates, I think, a hopefulness about the city's future and its ability to recover, and I think that is well justified. Even though the financial markets remain stressed, they have shown some signs of recovery since 2008. Credit markets have thawed, equity markets have improved, and a handful of major firms have returned to profitability in the first half of '09. Our real estate market, on the other hand, is continuing to slide. Primary commercial vacancy rates have risen to 11.5%. Sales activity in Class 1 residential properties is now 37% below activity in the first quarter of '08, and condo activity, which was the last to weaken, declined over 50% in the first quarter of '09 compared to '08. The current economic downturn is not likely to end quickly or painlessly, but the city entered this recession at a higher point than we've ever been and better positioned than ever to ride out the storm. The best course for action for the long haul, I think, is to continue to be fiscally responsible, just as we have been for the past 7 years. And that means, first and foremost, vigilantly working to keep our budget in balance by planning ahead and making the tough decisions when necessary. Second, diversifying our economy and strengthening other sectors so that Wall Street's losses do not bring down the rest of the local economy. And third, strengthening New York's competitive position by enhancing the already great quality of life that makes our city such an attractive place to live and do business. Let me briefly discuss each of these three strategies. First, as your staff report indicates, we need to continue exercising the same fiscal discipline that has allowed us to keep the fiscal year '09 budget balanced and adopt a balanced budget for the fiscal year 2010. We always knew that economic booms don't go on indefinitely, so when times were good and New York City enjoyed unprecedented budget surpluses, we used our good fortune to prepay expenses and prepare for leaner times. And that's why we were able to roll approximately $5 billion in previously accumulated revenues into the fiscal year 2010 budget. We knew that our resources would not be enough to get us through these hard times and that spending cuts, however, were also necessary. So we asked our agencies, which had already begun to tighten their budget belts through 2008, to continue to do more with less without jeopardizing city services. And they have, with a total of more than $3 billion in budget closing actions. We also knew that closing the budget gaps was not something that we could do alone, and that we'd need help from New Yorkers and from our partners in government and labor. I'm pleased to say that earlier this year, we came to an historic agreement with the city's municipal unions and made changes to the New York City Health Benefits Program. These changes will save the city more than $200 million over each of the next 2 years and $150 million every year after that. On the revenue side, we worked with our partners in the City Council to push for changes in the city's tax structure. On the one hand, we asked New Yorkers to help generate some of the needed revenue, just as they did during the last recession. We eliminated a previous reduction to the city's property tax and raised the sales tax by 0.5%. And on the other hand, we reconfigured our business taxes to make New York City a more attractive place to do business, especially for small businesses. We reduced or eliminated the unincorporated business tax now paid by some 17,000 freelancers and self-employed contractors. And we lowered taxes on more than 18,000 business headquarters in our city by going to a single sales factor of taxation. As you know, some of these critical reforms required legislative approval from the state, and we thank the governor and all our leaders in Albany for passing the necessary laws. In the months ahead, we'll have to keep a close eye on the economic indicators and take whatever steps are necessary to keep our budget for fiscal year 2010 in balance and keep our city moving forward. Compounding the difficulties in our economy, as everyone knows, is another very serious threat, however, the rising cost of non-controllable expenses such as health care benefits and pensions. Even in what we hope will be a recovering economy, the outlook for the city's budget in fiscal year 2011, which is projected to have a gap of $5 billion, is very troubling, and those gaps won't disappear in the out years. By the year 2013, our pension costs will have risen to $7.6 billion and account for nearly 11% of total expenditures. To protect our city's economic health, we must find ways to contain these spiraling costs. Already, we've made some important progress towards that goal. In June, we reached a tentative agreement with the United Federation of Teachers that will save the city $2 billion over the next 20 years. The agreement reforms pension plans for newly hired UFT members, while at the same time preserving health and pension benefits for current UFT members. And I'd like to commend the United Federation of Teachers and its leadership for their willingness to work with us. The creation of a new pension tier for other employees, which our administration has long been urging, is the only responsible way to address the long-term fiscal health of our city and state. Governor Paterson recognizes this, and the new tier he's proposed would save city taxpayers $7 billion over the next 20 years, according to initial estimates. I appreciate the governor's leadership and look forward to working with him to continue to find long-term solutions to some of our greatest economic challenges. And if the cooperative spirit that's been shown in balancing this year's budget among the City Council, Labor, and our partners in Albany continues to guide us, then I feel confident that our city will see its way through these challenges. The second key to our city's long-term economic health is diversity. The fact that local industries outside of financial services are now performing better than expected suggests that our efforts to reduce the city's reliance on Wall Street, something we focused on intensely over the past 7 years, are helping to speed our economic recovery this time around. Our administration will continue to pursue its successful 5-borough economic opportunity plan with the goal of strengthening the city's standing as a global financial capital while also working to foster growth in a wide array of other industries. For instance, last week we announced our plan to invest in the more than 3.5 million square feet of city-owned industrial space and develop a sustainable working waterfront district in Brooklyn's Sunset Park. That plan alone will spark the creation of some 11,000 new industrial jobs over the next 2 decades. We'll also continue our investment in tourism and in attracting marquee events like this month's NAACP Centennial Convention. It's true that tourism slowed in the first quarter of '09, but we have seen since a number of indicators move up, including hotel occupancy and room nights. And while it will not reach last year's record level, tourism remains a viable industry for our city and one that will continue to grow over the long term. We're also working to spur growth in the city's emerging bioscience community through the creation of the East River Science Park, a campus for commercial research that stretches along Manhattan's Fifth Avenue Medical Science Corridor. Last week, global pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly and Company committed to moving one of its ImClone research divisions into the Science Park's first building. And the company's dedication, I think, is a great vote of confidence in the future of our city. And I think it points to the third reason why New York is weathering the storm better than anyone expected and why we'll bounce back from this recession stronger than ever. As Comptroller Bill Thompson acknowledged in a recent report put out by his office, the city's competitive position is inherently stronger today than it was during previous downturns, and that is mostly due to an improvement in the delivery of municipal services that contributes to the unbeatable quality of life that exists here. When our nation's economy first entered the recession at the end of 2007, many feared that our city's quality of life would begin to slip, that crime would rise, that our streets would get dirtier, and that companies big and small would head for the suburbs. I'm happy to say so far that has not happened. We've worked hard to defy the conventional wisdom by continuing to increase our city's quality of life even as the economy has turned downward. And today, crime is down more than 36% from where it was 8 years ago. Overall crime is down 12% this year compared to last, and murders are down 18%, putting us on track to record a new record low. Our public safety gains, I'm happy to say also, aren't limited to law enforcement. Fire fatalities, ambulance response times are also at modern lows. Our streets are cleaner than they've been in 30 years, and a new graffiti removal program will help us clean up graffiti even faster and more efficiently. Our school system is improving too. We've seen double-digit gains in test scores, and graduation rates are up more than 20%. And even, as we've worked to enhance our city today, we've continued investing in its future to keep major upgrades to our water and transportation networks on track. Our efforts to enhance the city's great quality of life are really making a difference, and instead of fleeing the city as they did in past recessions, it's fair to say businesses are choosing to stay and even expand in New York City. They are placing their bets on a city with low crime, good schools, and strong neighborhoods. Their optimism about our city's future is heartening, and it's just one of the many reasons I feel so confident that we can get through these tough times, just as we have done before, and come out even stronger. The City Council, in particular Council Speaker Christine Quinn, and our partners in Albany, including Governor Patterson, all deserve credit for helping us achieve a record of fiscal responsibility while making New York more livable, more business-friendly, and more economically diverse. And by continuing to work together in a spirit of partnership, I'm convinced that the Comptroller and the Mayor and the City Council can keep making the city's immediate and long-term budget needs something that we can attain and ensure that New York City's best days are still ahead. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, Mayor. That is a very comprehensive presentation of the city's economic plan and the history of endeavors it's taken to combat the fiscal crisis, the plan being from the years 2010, 2013. It would now be appropriate for our New York State Comptroller, Thomas DiNapoli, if he chooses, to comment on the plan.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Mayor, for the presentation. I've distributed for the members of the board our detailed review of the city's financial plan for your consideration. I'll just offer these brief comments. 2 years ago, New York City's economy was booming, and the city's coffers were overflowing with record budget surpluses. Today, revenue losses are mounting as the recession takes its toll on the state and local economies. New York State's economy contracted at an annual rate of 5.9% during the fourth quarter of 2008 and 4.3% in the first quarter of 2009. The state has lost 227,000 jobs over the past year. City tax collections, excluding recent tax increases, were down by $3.3 billion in fiscal year 2009 and are projected to decline by another $2.4 billion in fiscal year 2010. A cumulative drop of $5.7 billion. While the economic recovery is expected to be weak and slow, New York City could benefit from an early Wall Street recovery if recent earnings reports are sustained. After posting losses of $42.6 billion in 2008, the securities industry reported record first quarter profits of $8.2 billion. Several firms have also reported strong profits for the second quarter. While the news is encouraging, we certainly can't count on Wall Street to solve our budgetary problems. The securities industry still faces serious challenges, such as rising credit card defaults. The industry's high employment multiplier is still working in reverse, fueling job losses in other sectors of the city's economy. New York City has already lost over 115,000 jobs, including over 25,000 jobs in the securities industry. While the rate of job loss has begun to slow, the unemployment rate in New York City continues to rise and could exceed 10% by next year. New York State is experiencing its own fiscal crisis, and how the state balances its budget could have a direct impact on New York City. Large cuts in state education aid and local assistance were averted this year because the federal government provided resources from the economic stimulus program. These federal resources are only temporary, however, and state revenue collections have fallen short of expectations. Although New York City ended fiscal year 2009 with a $2.8 billion surplus, most of these resources were generated from actions intended to help balance the 2010 budget. Over the course of 2 years, the city has used most of the surplus resources accumulated during the last economic expansion and has raised taxes by $2.5 billion and cut planned agency spending by $3 billion annually. The city also obtained $1.6 billion in temporary budget relief from the federal economic stimulus program and has reached an agreement with the municipal unions to reduce the cost of health insurance. Despite these actions, New York City still faces a nearly $5 billion budget gap for next year. While there are signs the recession may be reaching the bottom and revenues could be higher than currently forecast by the city, significant risks remain, and the state and the city must remain vigilant. To their credit, the mayor and the city council have reacted quickly to the changing economic developments throughout the current financial crisis. The city should maintain its proactive stance and accelerate its financial planning process to get a head start on closing next year's budget gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Comptroller. At this time, we would yield the floor to the New York City Comptroller, William Thompson.
Thank you, Governor. Governor Patterson, Mayor Bloomberg, Comptroller DiNapoli, Mr. Summer, private members, and observers, good afternoon. I'm pleased to have an opportunity this afternoon to comment on New York City's finances. With me today is Deputy Comptroller for Budget, Marcia Van Wagner. In compliance with state law, the City of New York adopted a balanced budget for fiscal year 2010 on June 19, 2009. The size of the budget, $59.6 billion, is roughly the same as that presented in the executive budget released at the beginning of May. However, the adopted budget required new resources to address nearly $700 million in additional spending and a reduction in expected revenues of more than $200 million. These were funded through a variety of mechanisms that included eliminating a $530 million prepayment scheduled for fiscal year 2011 and shifting a portion of it to fiscal year 2010. As you know, our budget process this year takes place in the midst of a recession when tax revenues have evaporated. Fiscal year 2010 baseline revenues are expected to be $1.56 billion less than in fiscal year 2009. Personal income tax collections alone are expected to be approximately $3 billion less in fiscal year 2010 than they were 2 years ago, a reduction that exceeds 30%. The city has struggled to maintain budget balance since the impacts of the economic downturn became evident in mid-fiscal year 2008. At that point, the fiscal year 2010 budget was projected to total $66.8 billion after adjusting for prepayments. The adopted fiscal year 2010 budget reflects a reduction of $1.6 billion from that forecast. The spending reductions were coupled with significant revenue-raising actions, most notably a mid-year property tax increase in fiscal year 2009 that's expected to yield $1.2 billion in fiscal year 10. The adopted budget includes an additional $879 million in revenue from sales tax increases and business tax reform, as well as $2 billion in federal stimulus funds, including Medicaid cost relief. This budget exhausts the considerable reserves that have been accumulated from fiscal years 2003 to fiscal year 2008. Prior year resources were used to prepay debt service, health insurance, subsidies to various entities, and to fund other actions that reduce spending obligations by $5.64 billion. In our own review of the fiscal year 2010 budget, my office does not anticipate significant expenditure risks and takes a more optimistic view of tax revenue collections for the current year. We anticipate that fiscal year 2010 tax revenues may exceed the city's projections by $1.2 billion. As a result, there may be an extra $1.1 billion in the current year that could be available for unexpected contingencies or to apply to fiscal year 2011 gap closing programs. However, substantial risks in the city's gap closing program and its assumption that it will continue to be held harmless by the Financial Control Board from certain standards established by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board outweigh potential additional tax revenues. As a result, gaps could grow by $300 million in fiscal year 11, by $700 million in 12, and by well over $900 million in fiscal year 2013. The mayor is required by the city charter to submit a preliminary budget for the coming fiscal year to the city council in January. In 6 months, a preliminary plan to close the $4.9 billion fiscal year 2011 gap must be in place. The additional resources anticipated by my office would address only a fraction of that gap. Given the prolonged period of budget retrenchment the city has already endured, there are a dwindling number of gap-closing options that do not entail noticeable service impacts or tax increases. Only twice since fiscal year 1987 has the budget gap at the time of budget adoption been higher than the projected gap for fiscal year 2011. In 2003, it was closed when the aggressive PEG program, which included both substantial tax increases and significant spending reductions. In fiscal year 2006, tax revenues resurged unexpectedly to help eliminate the gap. Since that resurgence was a byproduct of the recent credit bubble, a similar performance is unlikely to be repeated in the near future. As we've documented in previous reports, recent gap-closing actions have had a recurring impact and have contributed to narrowed gaps in coming years. However, the gap-closing programs have been dwarfed by one-time actions that artificially reduced fiscal year 2010 spending obligations. The use of surplus resources to prepay obligations has greatly assisted the task of balancing the fiscal year 2010 budget. But while those obligations recur in the out years of the financial plan, the resources do not. The budget does not include initiatives meant to contain spending growth in areas such as pensions, debt service, and employee health insurance, the costs which have all expanded greatly in recent years. The city has significantly reduced its capital program to slow the growth rate of debt service. Unfortunately, the benefits of this action won't be felt in the short run and are obtainable only if future capital budgets are smaller than in the current year. While the Municipal Labor Committee has agreed to certain changes in the distribution of the health insurance cost burden, additional savings included in the financial plan have yet to be negotiated and are at risk. Similarly, the creation of a new pension tier has yet to be approved by the state legislature. A year ago, I noted that the city would face a lengthy period of stagnating revenues and increasing costs, making the task of balancing the budget extremely challenging. Laboring against strong headwinds, the city has succeeded in reducing the projected fiscal year 2011 budget gap by slightly more than $200 million since the fiscal year 2009 budget was adopted in June of 2008. The potential for a surplus in fiscal year 2010 and the availability of funds from the General Reserve and other sources could provide some resources to partially address the 2011 gap. However, absent additional aggressive actions, there still would remain a substantial shortfall even under an optimistic scenario. Pressure from the budget has led the city to abandon two practices that in recent years have bolstered its long-term fiscal position: pay-as-you-go capital spending and a reserve fund for retiree health benefits. In January of 2008, $700 million in funding for pay-go was removed from the capital financing program, and the retiree health benefits fund is now being tapped for gap-closing purposes. No replenishment of this fund is scheduled during the financial plan period. This is unfortunate, and the city should make every effort to resume both initiatives. I'd like to end on an up note by reminding that even in the toughest weeks after Lehman's bankruptcy last year, when the financial markets were largely frozen, our city muscled its way into the bond market, and in fact, we helped reopen the municipal market in early October. We have a ways to go in putting our city back on a firm fiscal footing in the wake of the current recession, but it's helpful to remind ourselves that we are a long way from the dark days of the fiscal crisis 30 years ago that precipitated the Financial Emergency Act and the creation of this body. And again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Controller Thompson. Under the Act, at this point in the annual meeting, I'd like to thank the staff, to the board, and also our Acting Executive Director, Jeffrey Sommer, with time granted at this point for him to give a reaction to the city's plan.
Thank you, Governor. The Control Board staff issued its report on the city's four-year financial plan on July 22nd. I would like to review the findings of the report. The city will be able to balance the budget in fiscal 2010 with the use of prior year surpluses, agency reduction programs, tax increases, and federal stimulus funds. With all of the prior year surpluses now used, and with the city projecting an almost $5 billion gap, balancing fiscal 2011 will be much more difficult. In order to balance the fiscal 2010 budget and knowing that the severe national recession and a local downturn centered in the financial sector would cause a large drop in non-property taxes, the city started as early as January 2008 to deal with the problem. The city started numerous agency reduction programs that ultimately will reduce expenditures by $3.1 billion in fiscal 2010. Additionally, the city reduced $2 billion of fiscal 2010 debt service costs by applying prior year surplus funds to defease general obligation debt that is scheduled to come due. To buttress a loss of $1.1 billion in city funds by a fall in tax revenues, the city also reimposed 2 property tax reductions, received state permission to raise the city's sales tax rate, and made some changes to the business taxes. These actions also have offset expenditure increases primarily due to growth in wages and fringe benefits, as well as debt service costs. Over the 4 years of the financial plan, while 2010 is balanced, the city projects gaps of almost $5 billion in each of fiscal years 2011 and 12, and growing to $5.6 billion in 2013. Our analysis shows possible lower revenue collections in both non-property and property taxes, as well as additional expenditures related to overtime costs and pollution remediation not accounted for in the city's plan. Furthermore, the labor concessions in the plan, which need legislative action, are outside the city's control and, if not agreed to, will add to the city's budget imbalance. Our risks bring the city's projected budget deficit in the out years of the financial plan to more than $6 billion in each of 2011 and 12, and almost $7 billion in 2013. The out-year gaps continue due to a slumping economy and growing costs for wages, pensions, health coverage, and debt service. With the city and the nation in the midst of a severe recession, it appears that the path to economic recovery will be long and uneven. To help restart the city's stalled economy, the federal government is furnishing $4.2 billion in economic stimulus grants targeted mostly at medical assistance and education programs. Meanwhile, the city projects that pension costs will climb vigorously over the life of the financial plan, accounting for nearly 11% of the total expenditures by fiscal year 2013. While not having a direct impact on the city's financial plan, the rapid pace in which the unfunded liability for other post-employment benefits is likely to grow in the future is a concern. Our analysis of the OPEB liability projects that this unfunded liability will surpass $96 billion by fiscal 2013 and will continue to grow in the future. While the city created a trust fund by using prior year surpluses to allocate $2.5 billion to the trust to begin addressing this growing liability, it has not added any resources to the trust fund for the years covered by the financial plan. In fact, as the OPEB liability continues to grow, the city is planning to draw down funds that total more than $1 billion over the fiscal 2010 to 2012 period to deal with pension investment losses. In conclusion, with no prior year surpluses left to be used, the city, as it has successfully done over the last 2 years, should develop actions that, while not necessarily needed to balance the budget in fiscal 2010, can be used to start to deal with the large 2011 problems. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you. At this